without giving too much away of your presentation, can you tell me a little bit about like some of the scenarios that he goes through that really change him?
Sure. I mean, you know, one of the things that I sort of establish in the very first issue is actually just how horrible a person he is. He assassinates a person who is no longer a vampire. You know, one of the great sort of tropes in sort of vampire fiction is if you kill someone further along in the bloodline, the rest of them sort of return to humanity. And I had this group of characters who were basically these mafiosi who were, you know, preying on people in the Bronx. And Marley goes by, you know, systematically, you know, eliminating them. But several of them basically return to a human state, and he still kills this guy. It's those kinds of questions, you know. His partner in that story, Samir Hudson, who's with him, you know, just can't believe what he's done. And that's the way we literally end the first issue. As the stories have gone on, there is an increasing like butting of heads about how to proceed. You know, how do you know, there's no such thing as a good war. But Marley's convinced he's fighting one. You know, no matter what complications come up. So eventually, as the series goes on, as we move back and forth, you know, through time, because I basically just do them in different year points just to try and, you know, shake things up and basically show how radical, you know, the changes in his perspective become over time. That's really the point, you know. And it's just, you know, for me, it's always been fascinating, like, when I read about, you know, far-right people, you know, neo-Nazis, especially in America, like, what the dissonance you have to engage in to hold on to those ethics. It's like, all right, so you can't listen to rock and roll because black people were involved in that. You can't watch any movies because, you know, basically Jews invented that industry and that, you know, entertainment complex. You know, can't eat a whole spectrum of food. It's just, your world becomes small. It's like, you know, just like water, just like wearing away the edge. And so you're on this little island. And it just, that mentality just fascinates me. Like, how can you, it's impossible. You can't do it. You, in the end, would have to go absolutely insane. And, you know, that's what's coming from Marley, basically. So, you know, for me, it's, again, it's trying to leverage horror and science fiction, which I love, and taking it from being something that's, you know, just a chess game of characters and making it sort of into social commentary, which I think it inherently is. It really is. I mean, again, to me, you look at something like the vampire myths, and it's just fascinating that it's always some rich, creepy guy, you know, who's like lording over these peasants and like feeding on people in the countryside. That had to be invented by a bunch of people who were pissed off, or retailored as time went on, who were pissed off at, you know, the family on the hill.
And all the zombie themes, the underlying zombie themes are very
oh yeah. I mean, that's I have to tell you, if you had told me 10 years ago that this stuff was going to blow up the way it did, the zombie stuff in particular, I would have said you were crazy. I just didn't. I mean, I grew up with that stuff, and I personally love it. But a lot of it was pretty flat and pretty bad in the 80s. It was, you know, basically violent porn. It had very little to do with George Romero's initial film, which is an incredible indictment on American culture. All of his films are, frankly. But, you know, there's an existential question he poses in Night of the Living Dead that's been answered by very few pictures that pretend to be sequels or part of that world, part of that milieu. And that question is, when civilization is wiped away, who are you? You were an accountant yesterday, and, you know, your ability to create Excel tables means nothing now. But maybe your ability to count, your ability to be organized means something. Maybe it'll help you survive. And, you know, who are you at the end of the world? You know, how, in that world, human beings become as big a threat to each other as the thing they're facing, as happens in the real world, right? You know, in places where you have starvation and depravity and, lack of an infrastructure, people turn on each other. Black markets emerge. Organized crime emerges. And the other big existential question he asks in that picture is, how much of that world do you become in order to survive, and at what point is it no longer worth it? When you look at Day of the Dead and Dawn of the Dead, the other pictures he did, Dawn of the Dead infamously takes place in a mall, in an underground mall, which, today, you look at it today and it's mind-blowing how on point he was about consumer culture. And, to me, there are powerful things that can be done with horror. Very often it's not done because it's easier to just, do a wrestling match, between a bunch of characters and have a bunch of heads fly all over the place. And, it jars people, it excites them for 90 minutes, but it doesn't really give them anything. It's not in the service of anything bigger, and it always can be. That new Walking Dead show, which is based on Bob Kirkman's comics, he was probably the first person since Romero's last pictures to take up those existential questions about, how far do you go to stay alive? At what point are you no longer living, and at what point are you defending some notion of existence that is so far from what your values were? What's beautiful about that comic when I read it was the character Rick, the sheriff, wakes up in a hospital. He had been shot before everything happened. He wakes up, no explanation. He wakes up in a hospital and there's just people, running around eating each other and whatever. But the remarkable thing is, he gets out of the place. He has no human being to talk to explain to him what's happening. And what he does is he goes to his job, he puts on his uniform, he puts on his hat, he puts on his badge, and he walks his beat back to his house. Now that's either an act of insanity, or it's actually a really beautiful statement about this person who stands there and says, civilization is wherever I'm standing. I'm not going to surrender to this disaster. Wherever I'm standing, wherever I'm thinking, as long as I have a heart that's beating, I will try and hold on to what civilization was. And that's a profound answer to George Romero's initial question about who are you when the grid goes down. We've lived through that in New York. We've had blackouts, and those are really, really telling moments when you see what your neighbors are really like. We just went through it with Hurricane Sandy, where, people opened their doors downtown so people could charge their phones and get in touch with each other. People got together and got out to the Rockaways to, help seniors who were trapped in high-rise buildings. And that's a great story to tell. You don't see it told in zombie pictures because it's too messy, it's too complicated. But The Walking Dead did it, the comic book did it. A lot of it is procedural stuff about how people, where are they going to live? Should they live in a prison? Should they find a farmhouse? Trying to think through it. And, those can be great affirming stories about the human condition. They rarely are, unfortunately. And again, as someone who loves that fiction, I'd like it to be something more relevant than just, a series of aesthetics and conventions that appeal to, a bunch of people who like to see stuff explode.